Hi, my name's Arman, and you're listening to Tiny Synths and Friends. Let's explore the curious world of tabletop music devices designed by individuals with a deep desire to create something personal and unique. In this episode, I'll be talking with Zack from Infinite Digits out of Seattle, Washington, creator of a series of sample-based sequencers. Let's take a listen. Let's go. Hi, Zack. Welcome to the show. First off, I'd like to ask you, what got you interested in music?
I think I got interested in music when I visited my grandparents and they had one of those old electronic keyboards that had like synthesized sounds. And I just loved the violin sound. It was like totally a bad violin sound, but I just remember it was so endearing. And then from then on, I was just like, I learned piano and then went through music through that route. So more classical, but I got into jazz. And I didn't pick up like electronic music. I did a little bit in, 12? I got a Alesis KS 8.1, I think. And I loved the sounds on it. It was so cool, but I never got into making sounds until I feel like I really got into electronic music with Super Collider and making sounds. And that was only, I guess, 6 years ago, 5 years ago, something like that.
I want to go back to that organ. Do you remember what the name of that thing was?
I think it was like a Yamaha. I don't know. That one I don't quite remember. We had in our house, was it I don't want to say it wrong. I think it was Kawaii. It's horrible. It was from the early 90s. The sounds are so bad. The velocity sensitivity is really, really bad. But it's still inspiring, actually. There was a cool handbell sound that was really nice. I had really long release. It was that was a great sound. The harpsichord sound was really good. But the regular piano sound was anytime I found a real piano, I was like, why do I have an electric piano? And I really didn't like electric pianos for a long time because of that. And it took until 15 years where I started liking electric piano sound. Pianos that are electric or digital, the acoustic piano sound on them.
Not like a Fender Rhodes.
Fender Rhodes is my favorite sound. And I got, that's the piano I have, is Korg SV1, because I love the Fender Rhodes sound. And the acoustic piano sound on that piano is really, really good. And that's my main piano. That is my piano. I use that for gigs when I played in bands, and I used it at home when I practiced. And it has synthesizer sounds, but they're not as fun as programming synthesizer sounds. I feel like they're limited.
So I'm still envisioning this. The grandparents' organ, is it like a church organ with the big toggle switches? And
No, it was an electric piano. It was a digital piano, but it was one probably from the very early or late 80s, probably. Very, very old. I don't remember what it was, but it was fun to play. And my grandfather would play show tunes. He had a book of all of the theme music for TV shows, and they're fun to play because they're really short and they're catchy.
Nice.
So I learned a bunch of those when I was younger.
What was your favorite one?
I like Bewitched. It's an old one.
So you said you played in bands. What were some of the bands that you played in? Did you play keyboards in those bands?
I played keyboards in when I was really young, and some guitar. And then I played in jazz, when I was older, some novice jazz groups, I would say. And then most recently R&B and a marimba band. I'm not playing right now, but that was the last two bands. I was doing R&B, kind of Beatles-esque. I was doing keyboards, and marimba, I was doing the marimbas.
Wow. Do you have a marimba?
I don't anymore. But yeah, I had to stop because I started traveling a lot. So I was like, I can't keep this giant instrument when I'm not using it.
So, at what point did you become infinite digits?
I think that was in like 2019 or something. I needed a Instagram handle, so I chose that. And then I just used it as a username because I liked it.
Does the name have any particular meaning to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a math person, so I like, it's like irrational numbers. They have infinite digits. And I think of it sort of also in terms of like digital music. Like you need digits to express certain tones. And like the more you have, the better. Like up to a certain point, like 16-bit is great. But like if you have more and more digits, you can get more and more precision. And then I guess if you take it to the highest level, if you have infinite, maybe it's the best, but actually it doesn't matter that much at the high level.
So, you describe yourself as a math person. What is a math person?
Yeah, I studied math at university and I did a lot of math in high school. I just think math is like a math person is you kind of dig down into what is the fundamentals of things a lot. Like math people have these axioms and they use those to like describe basically everything. And the idea is like at the fundamental level, what is happening? And so you go down and down and down and down until you get to the fundamental level, and then you kind of understand what's happening and then you can build things back up. I think it's super useful for like understanding synthesis and stuff because it's all math.
It sounds like you became interested in synthesis at an early age.
Yeah, but I didn't really have the tools to play around with it, and I didn't know about the tools that were around. Like the digital workstation stuff, I never played around with. Superclutter was around in the 90s, but it never crossed my mind. I ended up trying to make a lot of tools to do music stuff, like very naively. One of the things I made probably like 8 years ago now is a AI that plays piano. This is before AI. It's it was kind of cool. It was basically a little Raspberry Pi that you plug into a piano and then you play, and then it uses like tons of Markov chains to like remember what you're playing. And then when you stop playing, it will play something in the style that you were playing. So I would use it for like jazz piano where I'd play like a little lick and then I'd go to the chords and then my little AI would like play the rest of the lick. There's YouTube videos of this if you want to check it out. It's actually, I think it holds up. I think it's still pretty cool. Like, even though there's like so many more sophisticated ways of doing this now, like Markov chains go really, really far. I mean, basically LLMs are like kind of like a Markov chain.
Describe a Markov chain.
So it's like if you play a sequence of like 8 notes, you can take like each note, like a pair of notes, and then say, what is the most likely next note given this pair of notes? And so you can do that for like every note. But then I think the cool thing is when you do that also for velocities and durations of notes. These notes have all these things: velocity, like pitch, duration. So you make a Markov chain for all those things, and then you can correlate them. You can get like kind of complicated, but basically then for every note that it plays, it'll generate a note based on what it remembers you playing and what it has played recently. And it's all probabilistic. So it's somewhat random. And you can get like cool things out of it. The hard thing with all of this stuff, like music generation, is getting it to sound human because it gets into like the uncanny valley very easily with these things. And I think that one I really liked. That one sounded good, but I had a lot of hard times with other music generation stuff.
And were you trying to like fuzz it out with error or something to try and make it sound more human?
I think that the key was velocities. I don't quite remember. I wrote a blog post about it, but when you play straight notes, it sounds like when you play back MIDI, a lot of times it's like the same velocity and it'll just sound like do 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 do. And it's very monotonous. And that's a style of playing, but it's very hard to do that as a human. And it's very easy to do that as a computer. So as a human, I think it's important to try to make the computer like have more dynamics, whether it's in the timing, like if it's slightly off, like slightly ahead, or in the like volume dynamics, like is it like getting louder, softer, louder, softer? I think that is so key. That is so key. And I try to incorporate that in everything, and it helps immensely. But there's a lot of like cool synthesis techniques to make things sound more real, like detuning, um, adding some like reverb stuff.
So those early piano experiments were based on a Raspberry Pi single board computer?
Yeah, that was all of that was written in Python, writing my own weird libraries and using MIDI controllers, so like MIDI devices. So I'd write Python code and then use a MIDI device as like the output versus like a synthesis. I would just like whatever piano I had at the time I would use.
How did you end up falling into the world of Super Collider and the monome norns?
During the pandemic, um I got more interested in music coding, and I was like kind of looking for a device to make it easier, and I saw the norns and I was like, I don't know what this does, but it seems like you can program it and it sounds cool. So I got one. And that was like enough to like, yeah. And it was like my dream instrument because it's super easy to program. The scripting language is really nice. And then it also has Super Collider in the back end. So you can get really deep into the sound design. And that was perfect. That's like all the stuff I was doing with Python for all these years. Like it was done so much better on Norns. And there was a screen and there was knobs and buttons. So it was like, yeah, a dream instrument. I had tried Pure Data before, and I bounced off it because I do LabVIEW at work and I just can't stand visual programming languages. So that I had a chance to like get into digital synthesis through Pure Data, but because of the interface, it didn't work for me. SuperClair is much better for me in that sense, is this like linear programming.
What was your first norn script?
Oh yeah, first North script. It was a delay. Basically, it uses the soft cut and it will delay something, but every time it delays, it like pitches it up, pitches it down, and then that feeds back into the delay. So you get like this weird, like bouncy, pitchy, like artifacts that are on the tail of everything you play. And it's my favorite thing. And it's synced to a beat too.
Is it possible for you to name all of the norn scripts that you have created?
Yes, if I look at the norns.community website.
You were kind of on fire there for a while with so many scripts coming out, and I just feel like you almost single-handedly kept that whole community alive and fresh for so long. And I think they just, I don't want to say something like they owe you so much, but you just really made that little box shine for a lot of people. And the fact that it is open source and the fact that there's really not any monetary gain in it for you was just, I don't know, it set a really good example for me. And I think it probably set a really good example for a lot of people of what a community like that could do.
That's super nice. That's super nice.
I mean, there has to be more than 20 scripts. I'm thinking 20, 30.
Yeah, let's
I don't know.
see here. I'm going to just check. I have a list of them from the website norns.community, a great website. It looks like I have 40.
Yeah, that is incredible. I will maybe have to do a show where I just try and go through every single one of them, figure them out. It can take me like days to figure out a single script. Like, wait, what am I doing? Because like the manual is generally written in that one intro page, and if you don't scroll, maybe you missed something.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I think a lot of them, like I made a lot of them kind of with naivety in mind. Like what I found making yarn scripts is that people the ones that resonated well with people were ones that were very easy to grasp and almost like generate things on autopilot, but not completely autopilot. There's always some small input from the user. Like I had this a lot where I'd make something like acid test, I think is one, where it just like generates acid lines. And then maybe like L dash LL dash dash L dash that like just generates like sighing kind of tones, like resonant tones. People will say like, what am I doing? Like, how can I use this in my art? Because like this, because I'm not doing anything, it just feels like I'm just like using your art and putting it in my art. And of course, I don't buy that. I think anyone that uses these things, it's their art, like totally, like they're using it however they want. But I think the ones that really resonate, like Barcode, and these are ones that like they generate, you put in a little bit of sample and it does like wild stuff with it. So you have to put in a little sample to get it to work. But then it does like a bunch of magic stuff. And I think those are the ones that really resonate, where you have an interface. It's like weird stuff is going to happen, but you have to give me something to work with. Grandchild is kind of like that. Graintopia is kind of like that. And I kind of now gravitate toward that idea whenever I build some sort of musical instrument thing, is that I want it to do a bunch of weird stuff, but I don't want it to just go autopilot on its own completely, because then it's missing the user input. And some user input is like, I feel like it's like nice to have, to feel like you're doing something.
Yeah, you got to be the musician.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like in a performance, what I look for, like to me, like what makes a performance is the risk. Like there's a risk that it will all go wrong. And I kind of feel like that's necessary in an instrument. Like if you're playing piano and you hit the wrong note, it'll sound like, to you, it might sound wonky. Or if you stop playing the piano, you stop hearing sounds. Whereas there's a lot of electronic music instruments where if you don't touch it, it will just like sound great. And that to me is like low risk. And so I want something with some like low risk that you can like play with and like get into really fast, but still some risk is involved because it requires something from you. And if you give it something, you can always give it something weird or like something you don't want, and you get something out you don't want. I think that's crucial. Like you should be able to like put something you think is bad in and get something bad out. Like not everything that comes out good. Otherwise, yeah, I don't know. Maybe some things are always good to you. That's fine too.
Do you still perform? Like, are you taking the stage anywhere?
Have I performed? I performed. I did the live show online last weekend. The Blue Triptych concert series. That was the online one, and before that, I had done. I was in New York in January, and I did some performances at the monome place in Delhi, and I did a performance at William Hazard's place. He has like a series of poets and musicians that come play, and yeah, I did those. I like performing. This is performing by myself, like as Infinite Digits. And when I do that, it's kind of a lot of brain space because I like to create a whole performance like from scratch. Like I compose all this music and make some visuals, and it's a lot. Sometimes I'm like, why did I do this? Basically every time I perform, I have my Norn scripts and then I have a version of them for the performance, because I usually take a couple of scripts and just like change them completely so they suit me for the performance and what I'm trying to do.
Are you using primarily multiple Norns when you perform, or what's your gear setup?
Those last ones I used one Norns as like a end of chain kind of thing, and I wrote a script that I don't think I ever released that would like freeze audio, and I used it like a transition thing. It was really great. But the last performances, the bulk of the stuff was done in Super Collider. So my scripts on Norns like acrostic. this other one I have that I haven't released called Ouroboros. They're basically sample loopers, sequencing sample loopers. And I just found it, I wrote the whole thing again in Super Collider, and so I can just run it on my computer and then interface to Crow from my computer. And that was much easier when it's like traveling and stuff. I didn't have to worry about the norns. Not like bringing multiple norns. But I've done multiple norns too, yeah. My favorite thing that I've done in electronic music per se is one of the first albums I made was the Korg Monotron delay. And I made the OO script, basically would capture different loops of it. And each loop was a sequence of a melody. And it's monophonic. So I would do a melody like for 4 beats and then record that as a loop. And that loop would pan back and forth and go up and down in amplitude. And then I would do another 4 notes and another 4 notes. And I created the sets of notes in such a way that they will stack into chords. So as you go from loop to loop to loop, you get these stacks of chords. And in the OO script, basically, those loops are going back and forth in the spatial field and in amplitude. So they come in and they come out, they go left, they go right. So you get this very immersive symphonic kind of feel. And that is my favorite thing in the world. And I've probably made 4 or 5 scripts that just do that. So like Acrostic does that, Ouroboros does that, OO has a thing that does that, Paracosms does that, Zixfabin has a thing that does that. And I'm actually making a hardware device that does it too.
Yeah, let's get there, because I think a lot of people listening are coming at it from an interest in what you make, like real, like physical items too. So you transitioned to hardware a couple of years ago. I remember when I saw that, I was just blown away. I was like, no way.
Yeah.
Infinite Digits is making a thing. And I was kind of at a similar place where I was like struggling to figure out making PCBs and like, there's a lot to learn, particularly initially when you're trying to meet specifications of a manufacturing house that's on the other side of the world from you. And where I had no prior experience designing PCBs. I don't know about you, where you were coming from. So describe to me that process of getting into making real things.
I had very little. Also, in grad school, I made PCBs from scratch, but like etching them myself. And I just like the process is horrible. So I just like stopped doing it for years and years. But I got into it again because so I'm on GitHub and I have a lot of projects on GitHub, and some of them are very, very popular. One of them has, I don't know, like hundreds of thousands of users probably. And I pay for servers for some of them and I get almost no money back from them. And I was like, this is so strange. Like as an open source person, I have a lot of things that people are using. I know companies are using them because they contact me and they want help. And I'm like, okay, whatever. Like there's better ways to ask for help than just like making an issue. Like so I was thinking of ways to do software, but make it more sustainable in a way that I could actually recoup some of the time or some of the effort that I put into it. And I thought like maybe as an experiment, I'll try making hardware, because I feel like people feel like buying hardware is more amenable than buying software. Like I feel like we are so used to just getting software for free. We take that for granted. And if someone has a piece of software and they're selling it, you'll be like, no, I'll just get the closest thing that's free that does like the closest that does that basically. Whereas hardware, it's like also an object. And so there's like a value to the object itself. And I mean, you're paying for the software because that's part of the firmware, but you're also paying for the object. So I kind of felt like I could still make software and then make some money off it by making it into hardware, basically. Like basically making these Norn scripts or something into pieces, into objects. And this wasn't like a cash grab for me. This is kind of an experiment in doing open source, because all of my hardware projects are completely open source. Like all the hardware is, the software is. So it's like the same mentality, but like trying to make it more sustainable on my end. And I'd say it's moderately successful. It's like, it's definitely more sustainable than just releasing open source software and then getting tons of issues and getting no recourse for them. But it is running a hardware thing has all of these other hoops that we've talked about, like setting up a business, setting up like doing taxes. Like it's not just like people can download your code, people can buy your thing, but then you have to like make sure the government knows everything.
Yeah, there's a lot more not fun stuff to it.
It is, yeah. But I think it's worth it. I don't know, there's something amazing about having these objects, especially like musical objects, because they're not going anywhere. Like you put a battery in them and they'll do whatever they are programmed to do pretty much forever. Whereas software, I talk about this sometimes, like software seems to atrophy. Like you wrote code maybe 10 years ago in Python and it's probably not able to run anymore. Even like Node, I found Node projects from like 10 years ago don't run anymore because they have dependencies that are out of date and they don't work or whatever. So like that's really, I feel like that's not how it should be. Like we're designing the software, we should be designing it to last for a long time, at least as long as a piece of paper. But it's not the case. But hardware, like since the firmware is not OS dependent or whatever, it's like if you have the piece of hardware, it'll just keep doing that, which is really cool. You have to put in a lot of work into it, but it has that payoff, like that it will be there forever, like with your ideas inside of it. And that's so cool to me. Like that's like a really nice capsule of an idea versus like, I don't know. I'll be honest, like the best I've seen is like Java. My Java programs from 24 years ago still run with a GUI, like on Windows. That is like incredible. Whereas my Python programs for like 6 years ago don't run anymore because they're like dependent on some Python 2 crap or whatever.
Yeah, I struggle getting some Nancy Drew point and click adventure games from the late 90s, early 2000s going for my
Nice.
kids. You know,
Nice.
that's that is
Nice.
not easy to do. Just getting a CD to run. The first device that I remember you releasing was the nyblecore, and that's running on an AT Tiny.
Yeah, the AT Tiny 85. And I was curious to see whether you could put samples on it. And you can, but very, very, very little because like the program memory is so small. But it was a fun chip because I found you could put a sample on it and then you can literally, I wouldn't recommend, but you can plug headphones directly into the chip. Like literally into the chip and you will play through your headphones. It'll like, don't do it. It may ruin some good headphones, but if you do it with crappy ones, it's fine. But I thought that was so cool. So I made the nyblecore based around that so that it's like a little chip. It just sits in, there's like a volume knob and some knobs to change some like parameters. Like I put in like some retriggering stuff and some pitch bending stuff, really simple stuff because there's not a lot of room. And then you program it. So that's the tricky thing about it is that you have to have a programmer to like change the sample. So on my website you can like find the programmer and stuff. But I thought it was sort of like a cute little project. And I made some the ByteBeat firmware. There's an alternative firmware for it. I like it a lot though because I found it a great tool to like teach soldering. I did some workshops with it, and it's so small. And it's so satisfactory. Like you get like a thing that makes cool sounds, like weird sounds right away with like a half or like 24 parts, maybe like a dozen and a half parts. That's really cool. And so that was my other kind of idea going into hardware was like teaching soldering and doing classes, building things. So I made all the designs like with that in mind that people would do through hole components and like they're relatively easy and relatively cheap.
What was the first thing that you ever soldered?
Oh, that's a good question. In college, I got really into making things and I made some fun things. One was, it's not the first thing I soldered. The first thing I soldered, I think, was a amplifier and it worked, but it like blew out my speakers not my speakers, my headphones. And so I had just bought these headphones from Radio Shack. So I went back to Radio Shack and was like, these headphones don't work. And they gave me a new pair. And then I blew those out. And then I went back again and they gave me another pair. And I think that's partially why they went out of business. But
I used to work at Radio Shack, so that's another story for another time, another life.
Really?
Yeah.
I loved Radio Shack. I loved it. One of my favorite things I made in that time was I met this guy in one of my classes who wanted to make a 3D printer, a metal 3D printer. And this was way before 3D printers were like coming. Like they were on their way, like kind of like they had just started. And he's like, we got to make a metal one. And so we started doing it by, I was like, let's take a cathode ray tube TV and then use the electron beam in there. And that will be like our source to like melt like particles of metal. And so I wrote some software to control the cathode, like the beam. And it was like I could draw stuff on the TV. It was really fun. So I hooked it up to like processing. And so you could just like have this like graphics library, draw cool stuff. It's very fun. Like you can't do that with a regular TV now. Like
that sounds extremely dangerous.
Oh yeah, it's very dangerous. Like I was reading about how to do it. It's like, yeah, if you touch this thing, it's got huge capacitance and you may get shocked. But that's like a dumb thing I did.
That sounds awesome though. So you started with nyblecore, and that pretty soon after that we saw picocore.
The picocore is this little sample player. So it's the same idea, and this is actually the whole time I wanted to make a sample player, but I didn't have the like resources to do it and some of the know-how. So I wanted to like bootstrap myself. So I made the nyblecore and learned a little bit about like integrating firmware and doing samples. And so the picocore is basically a bigger version. It's still 8-bit. It doesn't have an audio DAC, so it's got like kind of the lo-fi sound. It still has the samples in the firmware, but it's using the Raspberry Pi Pico and the 60 megabyte version, so you can load in a bunch of samples into firmware. And then I had some new things where you can like jump around in samples. The samples are pretty long too, so you can do, my favorite thing is to like put in drum beats and then jump around in them and make like really funky things like reversing, pitching, time stretching. So I have all basic versions of those algorithms, a filter on this picocore. But the picocore was not like, I wanted something even bigger and I wanted an SD card. I wanted like more samples, higher fidelity, but the picocore was a start to get there. And then the next I think we'll talk about is the zeptocore, which is just like, that is what I wanted to make from the very beginning. Making hardware, the other thing is like, it's expensive, right? Like every time you make an iteration, you pay like $40, maybe, like unless your like thing is more complicated. And I went through too many iterations to mention.
How many? That's literally my next question I have written down here. How many iterations do you go through?
So the picocore I had 10. And they were pretty cheap, I think, because it's a lot of through-hole components. So I was mostly ordering PCBs. The zeptocore, I had 24, which is like, and some of them were like fully soldered, so they're sort of expensive. So that huge upfront cost was basically enabled through the picocore. So the picocore, everyone that supported me on that, like, you are the reason there is a zeptocore. And then everyone buying a zeptocore, you are the reason that there's an ectocore, and then everyone that buys that will be the reason that the next thing will come out, because like my ideas are getting a little bigger and bigger, and so it's costing more and more to develop.
The zeptocore, for those that are unfamiliar, or Pico and Nibble are all, the aesthetic is like bare PCB, visible components, tactile clicky switches.
No screen.
No screen, yeah, that's kind of number one actually, and a form factor that is like handheld and very small. Until you get into, I think, the zeptocore, there's no MIDI functionality, and the MIDI functionality is a breakout board for the Zepto.
For the Pico, it is actually, the Pico does have USB MIDI now, and the Zepto has USB MIDI, but they both have a clock input that you can use as MIDI also.
So one thing that fascinates me here with particularly the Zepto is that I think there's a new firmware version happening. Like, I can't keep track.
Almost every week.
What are we on? What are as of this?
Six.
Timestamp this. Let's just lock this down here.
So right now it's version 6. I just released today 6.1.0, which is the 109th version of the firmware.
The 109th version. Okay. Yes. Meanwhile, I've been laboring over version 2.
Right. Yeah.
I'm plugging mine in right now. I am totally curious where I'm at, and it should read.
Yeah.
I'm on 5. I'm not too far behind.
Yeah, 5. So 6, there's a change in the bank. So you have to bank from 1 to 16 instead of 0 to 15. That's the big change. But there's a bunch of stability changes in the filter and little changes.
And so when you are creating these things, you're putting sync and MIDI. So the intention is that these are, although they're incredibly fun to play with on their own, they can be a part of a system or your own setup. What kind of testing are you doing? What are you grabbing off your table to go, okay, what am I going to test for sync? Or, what kind of...
Yeah, that's a good question. Those are like a little bit of afterthought. I feel like the zeptocore to me is a device. I think it looks kind of like a groove box, but to me, it's like a groove box. Like you put in the sounds at different spots, like in your grid or whatever, and it like plays those back. The zeptocore, I wanted to just like constantly be playing, and then you interrupt it. So like you're not like, you can do this sequencing stuff, but like the main thing of it for me was like it does its own thing and you react to it. And so adding in the syncing was a bit of an afterthought because I wanted it to be like its own like wild thing. But I got it to work with the TB03. I thought that was a fun like a acidy kind of baseline thing. That was a fun thing to program with because I think it has a clock out. Or I was using MIDI out, I think, for most of it. But getting it to work with that was really fun because I was like, oh, this is kind of fun to combine with like a synthy line. And so I did all of my testing with that. But like MIDI never ends. Like once you add syncing, then you need like time syncing and then like MIDI start stop, and then you need like CCs. So it has like CC outs now. It has MIDI clocking, syncing all working well. It doesn't have like MIDI to like change the samples and like change the filter, like MIDI CC in. Because MIDI CC in also is like never ends. Like there's so many CCs out there, you can assign them to everything, but then at what cost? Like all of this is going to cost some CPU, and is it actually worth it? Like how many people are actually going to use it? That's what I ask myself. So I usually wait until someone's like, I really, 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 really want to control the sample start position with my keyboard. And so I'll add in, fine, yeah, let's do it. Let's add that in. But until then, I kind of wait until someone really wants it, or I want it.
It's so interesting to me because I've been collecting these things for a few years, and I get this feeling from all these boxes that they're somebody's vision of something that they wanted, a piece of gear that did this one thing, and then they make some concessions to sort of make it speak this language to other things.
Right. So all of my setup is on a desk. Like everything I have is on a desk. I don't have that much stuff. So like, and then if I hook up MIDI cables to everything, it's like a mess. And I'll lose track of what does what, like, how do I start something? So I just don't. So I use a tiny, tiny bit here and there, but mostly like my setup is not made for it. But after making this ectocore, a lot of people reached out and they have these setups where they have like MIDI things connected through hubs. And it's still a nightmare. It's like some hubs don't work, some hubs do work. You have to isolate, you have MIDI noise. Like, when it works, it works. So that is nice. That is nice.
We were at the Portland Synth Expo last March, April, something like that.
Yeah.
And you had a prototype of the Zeptocade. Not a prototype, but it was yours. It was like this kind of one-off thing that you had made. And that got a lot of attention. People really loved it. And I swear within, I don't know how long did that take you to all of a sudden turn that into a product? Because you were like, you told me like, I'm never doing this. This is like so much work. And like,
Yeah,
you were
yeah,
like,
yeah. I think it took a couple of months because it was like that was the wooden box with all the wires inside, and the wires were like it was with these arcade buttons, and every arcade button has 4 pins, and the pins normally have these wires like connectors that you have to connect to 4 other pins. And when you have 20 of these buttons, you have 4 times 20 times 2, because you have to connect on the other side of connections you have to like make. And it's like, no one's going to do this. This is ridiculous. So I spent a lot of time making like this little press-in connector where it's all positioned like there's the spacing is such that you can just press in the button into the connector, and it's way easier. It's a lot more solid because these arcade buttons, if you bend them the wrong way, they stick, and it's like a nightmare. It's super annoying. So I figured that out, and then I made a bunch of them, and I'm sold out now. They actually sold really fast. So they are like
the whole thing was so catchy. So congratulations.
Yeah, they're really fun. They're hard to make though, so I don't think I'm going to make any more anytime soon. Like I bought hundreds of buttons to do it, and then I had to throw away like 10% of the buttons because they would just stick when they arrived. Like, I don't know. Like, and the buttons are not cheap. Like these buttons are like $1.50, $2. So like the price of it also, like it was a little higher than I like. And it's just because the buttons are so expensive, and it had some of these expensive chips and large PCBs. But from that, I now understand that people like, I like the PCB aesthetic, but a lot of people like a box aesthetic. And so that's for my next thing, I'm working in more of a box.
Ectocore is on its way. Where are we at? Where are you at with that?
Yeah, ectocore is on its way. So that, my friend Isaac from Toadstool Tech basically reached out and was like, the zeptocore is so cool. I want to make it in Eurorack. And I don't do a lot of Eurorack, but I was like, I'm open to like total collaboration. So I thought, yeah, awesome. It's essentially like a different interface for the zeptocore in a Eurorack compatible interface. And it has like, because it's Eurorack, like the nice thing, you have like more inputs and outputs for like the CV. And so I wanted to be kind of creative in what I can do with them. And so one of the outputs I like is like it outputs a trigger whenever it hits a kick drum or a snare. And I found this, Facebook has this AI where you can stem drum samples. So anytime you upload a sample to actually the zeptocore or the ectocore, it has this thing where it'll split out the stems and then figure out where the kick drums are, where the snare drums are. And then on the ectocore, you can use those to like trigger other things.
And then it posts it to Facebook?
Oh no, so the Facebook Meta released, they have a AI that was trained on a ton of drums. And so you can use that to find the stems of all your drums. And it works really well. Like it's surprisingly good.
That is wild.
I think the guy actually stopped working at Facebook that made that, but he has his own maintained version.
Yeah, I'm still just amazed going back to zeptocore, how often and how much you're putting into those firmware updates. That I suppose, and it's open source, right? Like,
yeah.
Someone's brave enough, they can go in there and
Oh, this is the coolest thing. I think for the picocore mostly, because the picocore is simpler. It doesn't have a DAC. It doesn't have like a LED driver. You just hook up the GPOs. So you pop in the chip and then you solder a bunch, like not very many things, and then you have a picocore. So a lot of people have remixed it and like put the picocore into a giant like cigar box or like a metal enclosure or a guitar pedal. And then like they add in CV input sometimes. And it's awesome because it's all open. So like anytime someone's like, I want to make it into this other thing, like everything is on the website. Like you can just make it, go for it. I don't care. Like I love it. I love seeing when people remix it. The zeptocore is harder. I think there have been a few zeptocore remixes, but it's got like more buttons. So it's a bit trickier. but that one also is all open source. Like they are, if people want to remix them and change the firmware, that's why it's there. It's also there, like if I'm ever not working on it, it doesn't mean that the project is like gone. Like I know there's so many devices that like these old electronic devices that you can't really modify anymore because no one has the firmware for it, or like the company has, but you don't have. And I wanted to like make it available in the future that, yeah, you can just download the tool chain and then make your own firmware. I've made some alternative firmwares for the zeptocore, but I haven't released them yet. Still working on some. A lot of my scripts, like Acrostic OO, Ouroboros, they have this like voice leading sequencer sampler mentality. And I'm trying to make a box that encapsulates that. Because there's really nothing I feel that is doing that. It's basically a looper, but it's a looper that has modulation everywhere. And it's a looper that sequences and it generates the sequences. So like it's also a generative sequencer. Like you press a button and it makes chords. And what I love about it is that you just plug in basically any monophonic instrument you have, like whether it's MIDI or CV or whatever, and you spend your time changing the timbre and changing the sound of the instrument. You don't spend your time making the pitches. So like, I feel like with interfacing with these electronic instruments, you have a choice. You can interface with whatever you want, whether it's like the pitch, the timbre, the dynamics, or maybe all of them combined, but we only have two hands. So like, what do you want to focus on? And for this instrument, I love focusing on the timbre, the sound, like whatever, the delay, the tails, like all these things. I like there's a couple instruments I like, but basically just manipulating the filters and the sound, not doing the pitches. And so this box basically does that automatically. You can have some control over it, but I kind of like let the control go and just like learn the box, play with the box. But it also will have like a typical like asynchronous looper thing inside of it. And
is it live looping audio input, or is it you're loading an SD card?
Audio input. Yeah. It saves everything to an SD card so that you can go play with it later. But the idea is to use live audio with it. I'm toying with the idea of putting microphones on it so you can like talk into it. We'll see. There's a lot of ideas I'm toying with, but the sort of mentality is the same. It's like open source and no screen. That's kind of the biggest challenge, is that this interface has to boil down to something that makes sense without a screen.
I feel like that's kind of your aesthetic or your dogma, like no screen. Where's that coming from?
Right. I think it's coming from piano. Whenever I played a piano with a screen, it doesn't feel right. Like the screen is like annoying to me. I don't know why. It's I think with an instrument, the focus should be on the instrument. I guess some instruments, the screen is like a big part of it, but like to me, the instrument is like the tactile nature of it, like whether it's knobs or buttons or keys. And like, I think when I play an instrument, to like really feel like I'm inside of it, I want to be able to close my eyes and use it. And for things with screens, that's like impossible, because I can't close my eyes and like navigate the screen. Like if I want to navigate, like maybe there's a setting where you don't have to navigate a screen, but for me, the ideal is just to close my eyes and then know my way around enough that I can like get what I want out of this instrument. And so that like piano passes the test, like saxophone passes the test, guitar, marimba, they all pass the test. But a lot of electronic instruments, they don't for me. Like you have to like navigate, you have to go to the filter parameter, the filter page, or like this and that page. And then it takes me out of it. And I want to be like, I just want to close my eyes and just be with the instrument. But not all instruments are made like that. I totally get that. And that's fine. But I want to make some like that.
I love it. Does the new thing have a name? Is it a core?
Yeah, it's called the Ouroboros. It's not a core.
It's not a core. Okay.
It has a name. It's the ectocore.
What core?
The ectocore. But that's like its pseudonym right now. I think I might call it the Ouroboros. But I think I would like to throw out there, like, whoever's listening, like, it's easier now to do electronics and make musical objects than ever before. And there's so many resources out there. So like, if any of this is like sounding interesting, like, I would say jump into it. It's like, the water is like more shallow than ever before. Like, you can swim, you can get into it very fast. I don't know if you want to put links or something, but I have like, there's tons of resources. My website, I put tons of stuff like on how I did things, and other people do too. Like, there's a lot of these open source like makers, and I think for the most part, they're all happy to, like, you just look at it and try to get ideas. But I think this is like a amazing age we're in now, where if you have an idea for an object, like, it's easier now than ever before, cheaper than ever before. Yeah. So it's just about like, do you want to do it? And that question is a hard question sometimes, but you should go for it. People should go for it. I want to see more of these small musical objects in the world, for sure.
This has been Tiny Synths and Friends. Thanks to Zack from Infinite Digits for spending some time with me on the show. And thank you for listening. Links to all of Infinite Digits' relevant social media, shop, and more are located in the description of this episode.